live with you from Time Center for Advertising Week 13, and I am here with Adam Lavelle, who is the Chief Growth Officer for Digital at Merkle. Good morning, Adam.
Morning.
Are you excited to be here at
Absolutely.
Advertising Week?
It's exciting Monday morning, beginning of Advertising Week.
I know.
Everybody's sober, has coffee, ready to
right.
go. It's good.
Are you trying to say that by tomorrow they won't be? We'll see. We'll find out tomorrow.
Yes.
Okay, so I know that one of the things you guys are working on at Merkle, and you particularly in the digital space, is this whole concept of the 3 C's that we have been talking about when it comes to B2B. But you guys approach it a little differently.
Right.
Right? You switched out the last C a little bit.
We swapped one of the C's on you, yeah. So we have context, which I think LinkedIn's talked about a lot. We have content. And then where you talk about convergence, we say connectivity. I think it's very much the same idea. But for us, context is everything I could know about who we're targeting, who we're marketing to. What is every asset that exists inside the enterprise that you could possibly put in front of that individual? And then connectivity is the where, when, and how. It's when those two things come together. So it's basically the media moment. It's when you're making that impression, whether it's regardless of what channel, whether that's happening on bought media, earned media, or borrowed media, if you will.
Whoa, okay.
That's a lot. I threw a lot in there, I know, sorry.
We need to talk about that. That was a lot of medias that you just threw at me there. Okay, so first let me ask you, why the subtle shift from convergence to connectivity? Is it because you guys look at things slightly differently or see it as a slightly different approach?
Yeah, I don't think it's really, I don't think it's stepping outside of where the convergence idea was. For us, the convergence idea has a little bit of, it's loaded a little bit on the idea of devices, and certainly that's true. There's no doubt that people are moving fluidly across all sorts of different physical formats of devices. But for us, the idea that on top of those devices, there are different forms of media that live, and therefore there are different supply chains to figure out how to get to them. So if I'm going to buy an impression, that's very different than if I'm going to create some content, put it on my website, optimize it for search, and then hope that somebody comes and sees that content. So it's just the mechanisms to create those moments are different. And so we talked about that as the connectivity moment. So I think it's still very similar to the idea of convergence, where people are consuming all this media across the different channels.
So let's talk about that for a sec, because you did mention the different kinds of media and the nuanced differences, not even nuanced, I think pretty significant differences between how you approach those different medias, like the bought media versus the earned media versus. So let's talk about how you guys approach that a little bit.
Sure. Well, to do that, I'm going to step back to the context one, because for us at Merkle, that's really our main value proposition.
Okay.
We argue that today we have an opportunity to market to people, not to proxies. And when we say marketing to people, what we mean is not going out and getting panel data or just looking at cookies as a way to reach somebody, because those are really approximations for people. But increasingly we live in an environment where we can have an ID for someone. So Google has an ID, Facebook has an ID, LinkedIn has an ID, and marketers now are increasingly getting the chance to match their known customer to an ID and then market to that person. So if we start there, then the idea is once we know who we're speaking to, then the ability to do that by buying an ad impression, by creating branded content. Or sending them an email, all those things feed off of, am I putting that impression in front of this person?
Right.
So not just cookie where I'm guessing, but a real known person. So for us, that's what drives the strategy around what media to use.
Okay, around the context aspect.
Yeah.
So let's talk then a little bit about the content itself.
Yep.
Because there is the discussion, and we were just having a discussion a little bit ago about the concept of the creative content versus just the automation of it and so on. And so I want to kind of get your thought on how you guys approach that element as well, since we are talking about the 3 C's.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think we see increasingly that data is informing who we target, and I just talked about that a little bit. I think we certainly see data informing media decisions. So all sorts of data is being used by ad tech companies and agencies to inform when to buy media. But we don't see that data is being used a lot to help inform content. We're seeing the beginning of that. I think we see dynamic creative, dynamic content systems coming online. But one example I've always pointed to is at the Huffington Post. The Huffington Post has a content management system, and when a writer produces an article and puts it into that system, the system optimizes that article by recommending changes in words in the article.
Oh wow, I didn't know that. That's so interesting.
And then the writer can decide whether they want to accept those or not, and if they do, it increases the visibility of that. So there's keyword data coming from search engines that is optimizing content that's being created by a writer. So we think that's an early example of where content can be informed by data. So for us, a lot of what we're doing is trying to push the ball down the field on that. So we started very much as a direct response, database marketing and direct marketing, performance marketing agency, and so much of the work that we do in content is closer to the bottom of the funnel. So content that we think is going to drive someone to take an action, sign up for this,
so
apply for that.
Very direct
lower.
marketing.
And what we're seeing now is we have the ability to start moving further up that funnel, but but informed by data. And so it isn't just a creative concept, invest a lot of money to create a lot of content and hope it works. It's use the data about the audiences to drive the creation of content that we know is going to be relevant to a particular audience.
How do you think that affects the creative process?
Yeah, that is a great question, and we have over 200 creatives at our agency, and it's amazing.
Are they constantly gritting their teeth like?
They do. You know, it's fascinating when you give creative people rules and you give them a box. When you tell them they can't work out of this box, they become very creative within that box.
Oh, really?
They
Okay,
do. I think so.
That's great. I mean,
yeah. So it's crazy. I think we're probably the only creative department. Our agency's only creative department that has. We have 350 rules that we teach the creatives about what we know works and doesn't work.
Creatives generally don't like rules, right?
Yeah, turns out they love them, because then once they do those rules, then everything they do on top of that is where the creativity comes
Well,
from.
it's also, I mean, they can look at it from the other perspective, which is by working within your rules, I am optimizing my creativity and reaching the people who would most appreciate my creativity and have the most impact on them. So,
and it's not to say that that we're not designing with the brand in mind. Certainly, we have to be on brand. It has to be unique. It has to speak in the voice and tone of the brand. So certainly that has to happen. But we know there are conventions that when we put an email in front of you, or a landing page, or a banner ad, or even a direct mail piece, we know how to design those in ways that are going to elicit the action that we want.
Okay, so let's talk about the aspect of the different devices and so on, because that is certainly a conversation. I mean, there's an argument to be made that we have different experiences on our different devices, and then there's the argument to be made that there's the continuity of it all, or the conversions of it all. So how do you guys look at that?
Yeah, well, if I go back to the main point around the IDs and the idea of marketing to people, now technically we have the ability to know that we're talking to a person. So that allows us to orchestrate experiences across devices in ways that I think are fascinating. And I think we're still just getting there. But the idea that especially in a B2B environment, that somebody is going to move through a customer journey in a linear fashion, we know that's not true. And we know in many B2B decision processes, there are multiple stakeholders. There are influencers, executives, decision makers, committees. And so it's a very nonlinear process. So for us to be able to distribute content and create touch points that happen on mobile devices, on tablets, on laptops, and other places, digital out of home, digital programmatic TV, orchestrating that and the science behind that is I think growing. So it's a fun area. We're just getting going there in a lot of places, but it's definitely where I think things are headed.
Do you think it's really raised the bar for content? I mean, do you think it's really set it at a different?
I mean, certainly we see, I think, across B2B marketing, you can't talk about B2B marketing without talking about content marketing and branded content. I think many B2B brands are recognizing they have to behave like a publisher, and so they have to create content in all sorts of ways and fashions. I think it's it's something that's been going on the last several years. Some have gotten better at it than others. But I think it's an area that they have to be in. It's almost like there's an arms race for content, because if you're not creating content, either your customers are or your competitors are, and so your story gets told by other people rather than by you, and that's not what you want.
I think that's a really significant point and a great point to close on, because it's kind of like if you're not doing it, somebody else is, because everybody can nowadays.
Absolutely.
Like you said, even your customers can be creating the content and telling the stories, and and so you've got to be ahead of the game.
Super.
Adam, thank you so much.
Absolutely, glad to be here.
Enjoy Advertising Week. There's a lot going on, and like you said, a lot going on in the evenings too.
Yes.
But we're hoping everybody is still awake by tomorrow.
Super.
And
well, thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Stay tuned with us. We will be having more interviews right here on the LinkedIn Hub with Advertising Week 13.